A couple days ago, I was looking at reviews for this really underground game. Probably haven't heard of it. I've been looking forward to it for a while. It's called Black Myth: Wukong. Only sold a small 10 million copies. However, I came across this comment on Twitter.com, where all the most rational opinions come from and all the best advertisers are. And it was in response to IGN's review to Wukong, in which they gave the game an 8 out of 10. And this person responded pretty much saying, "That's great, thanks for the review, not high enough for me." And the first time I saw this comment wasn't the comment itself, it was actually from people retweeting it and kind of poking fun at the person and gamers in general for this attitude that an 8 out of 10 isn't high enough, that we're always looking for the next game of the year game, and we aren't willing to settle for just a fun 8 out of 10 romp, right? And at first, I was joining in a little bit. You know, I was definitely enjoying reading the comments and poking fun at this person for having such a strange opinion that an 8 out of 10 is they are too good for an 8 out of 10. But I started to think about it a little bit, and I kind of came around to being on their side a little bit. Like, not in all cases, right? But there are situations where an 8 out of 10 isn't good enough for me, right? Like, let's look at Black Myth: Wukong, okay? If we look at games that came out this year, just this year, and we're going to use OpenCritic for this, and it kind of uses some, like, it throws in some DLC and expansions and stuff like that. But if we look at OpenCritic, you have to scroll pretty far down to get to Black Myth: Wukong, which sits at an 81. That's actually even a little higher than an 8, right? 81, 8.1. It actually, funny enough, sits at 81. That's a lot of games. That's a lot of stuff to play. There's 80 things that have come out just this year. End of August is when I'm recording this. We're not even, we still got 3 months left, and it's the holiday season where a lot of the biggest games come out. We still have 3 months left, and it's sitting at 81 now, Like, it could be even lower then, but all right, of course, I can't compare a puzzle game to an action-adventure game, right? But even if I just set aside and said, hey, let's look at games similar to Black Myth: Wukong in their gameplay or scope or whatever else, there's so much stuff that's already come out in that regard, too. You've got Stellar Blade, you've got Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, you've got the expansion to Elden Ring, and a lot of people seem to have, a form of crossover between Elden Ring and Black Myth: Wukong. There's some people that are still playing through that DLC, man. That DLC was massive. It was basically a new game. It's my game of the year. Just throwing that out there. But even when we try to create a smaller section of games that Black Myth: Wukong would compete in, it's still based on reviews, big asterisk there, lower than a lot of other stuff. And of course, naturally, not everyone is going to be playing one genre all year long. I don't know anybody that's just the action-adventure aficionado and never plays anything different than action-adventure games or hack-and-slash games or whatever you want to describe Black Myth: Wukong as. There's going to be other stuff that's going to compete for your attention outside of this. This person might not be that interested in action-adventure games, but they heard a lot of buzz and they wanted to see, and if it was like a Game of the Year contender, they'd be willing to try it, and it wasn't that, right? If the game got nominated for Game of the Year, it would be the lowest scoring game to be nominated since 2017 at the Game Awards specifically. And if it won, it would be crazy. Like, it's the lowest to ever win was an 88, and that was twice between It Takes Two and I think Dragon Age Inquisition. Those are the only two games to score basically like below a 90 and win Game of the Year. It's not that common. There's a lot of 90 plus games that come out every year. There were 4 in the first 2 months of this year. Now, granted, there hasn't really been another one since. It's been kind of a slow year. However, my point still stands. And that's the big thing when it comes to these like judgmental comments about this person not being impressed with an 8 out of 10. When you look at the scope in gaming, an 8 out of 10 isn't that impressive, and there's probably something else they had on their radar that they could be playing. And also, you might not be an action-adventure guy, and want to see an action-adventure game of the year contender. You might not normally play Souls-likes, but you had to check out Elden Ring because of how big it was. Or an even better example, and an even more niche genre, I think, would be Baldur's Gate. There were so many people I know that didn't really have that much interest in a game like Baldur's Gate 3, but then it ended up being one of the highest reviewed games in OpenCritic's history, and everyone was talking about it, and it wins Game of the Year, and all of a sudden you've got this new influx of people checking it out. And while they might also check out other games similar to Baldur's Gate 3, there also isn't very many games similar to Baldur's Gate 3, I'll say, but they also might not. And that's kind of the big thing here, is that, like, for some people, for some genres, an 8 out of 10 is amazing, and for some people and some genres, an 8 out of 10 is just not good enough. If God of War 3 came out and got an 8 out of 10, you'd be like, what happened, right? That's not completely unheard of. And granted, Black Myth Wukong should not have the same expectations as God of War, well, 6, right? 6? Are we counting Ascension? 7? Whatever. There is a bit of a expectation versus reality that every person is going to have that's unique to them. Some people expected Black Myth Wukong to be a 9 out of 10, and when it gets an 8, a little like, okay, I guess I'll save my money. Games are expensive nowadays. Some people expected it to be a 7, and it being an 8 is really impressive. It's like, wow. I'm more in that latter camp, where I think that the game, I did not have high hopes for the game. I was like interested. I was like ready to see it, but it kind of had that like fake game appearance, right? Like it didn't look real anytime I saw it. Anytime gameplay popped up, it didn't quite look like a real game. Similar to like Atomic Heart, which Atomic Heart wasn't nearly as well received as Black Myth Wukong. I haven't played it myself, but I am interested in checking it out, and I probably will at some point, but an 8 out of 10 isn't high enough for me to spend $60. And that's the other important thing, is that gaming is expensive, and we want our money to be worth it. Especially for most people, they're not going to be playing that many games in a year, so them spending a lot of money, from their point of view, $60, $70 is a lot of money. $60, $70 on a game that either isn't good or isn't big enough, it's hard to swallow that, for sure. I can totally understand that. For me personally, I play somewhere around like 40 games a year on average over the last couple years, basically since COVID hit and I really started diving into gaming. And I can tell you that there's not a single person in my friend group that cracks 10. That's just modern gaming. It's so varied in people's experiences and where they're coming from, that when you have a whole bunch of people online on Twitter or whatever that are playing 30, 40 games a year, they're pretty happy with an 8 out of 10 because they've also played a lot of 6s out of 10s, right? But when you have someone who only plays 10 games a year, and so they're only playing the 9s out of 10s, you know, it's a different comparison, right? And that's kind of one of the interesting things about like Game Pass, is like with Game Pass, I feel like if I play a bad game, I don't really care as much because it's part of a subscription service. My brain doesn't really register that I'm paying for it, right? Because I'm paying for all of the things that are encompassed within Game Pass. So if I play 3 good games and 1 horrible game, I don't care as much about the horrible game because all of that was my $15 to $20. It's the exact opposite when you're actually paying for these things. When you're dropping $60 and the game's only a 8 out of 10, it can be a little deflating. So I just thought I would talk about this a little bit and offer a different perspective. I think it's an interesting conversation, and I want to have more videos like this because I think it's fun to talk about them. So yeah, do you agree? Do you disagree? Is 8 out of 10 good enough? Is it not? Are there certain genres where you bend a little more for an 8 versus others? I would love to know what your guys' thoughts are. For me, a great example would be a little game called Crow Country that came out earlier this year. It's like an indie Resident Evil Silent Hill inspired like PS1 era style horror game. And I played through the whole thing in one sitting, didn't get up like a single time. I was just so totally engrossed in the game. And that was another game that I might have considered skipping if it was more expensive. The game only ended up being like $20 or something like that, and it ended up scoring around the 80s, a lot of 8 out of 10s from a lot of people. I think it ended up being a little bit better than that for me, but it's a game that I almost skipped that I think I would have regretted skipping so early coming back to. And so that's a great example on my side of a game, type of game that even though it's an 8 out of 10, I didn't allow myself to skip it. And I was glad I did. But like I said, factoring in the genre and the price point, it makes sense to go with that one. If that same genre, that same game were $60 or $70, I probably would have skipped that at that price point. So thanks for joining me for this one. Leave your comments below, telling me what you think, and you guys have a good one now. Peace.